Thanks for joining after lunch. That's always the hardest session, I believe, right after lunch. Hope people won't fall asleep during the session. I'm Felix, product manager at Camunda, with the company since 2016. Have been in different roles over the time, currently focusing mostly on the orchestration cluster, the core of Camunda itself. And today we're going to look a little bit through our journey of identity and access management, and we will also see a live demo of the new capabilities, and we will also look into the future of what's going to happen after 8.8. So 8.8 is the next release that's coming up next week. And of course, there's a little bit of time for Q&A. That depends a little bit on how well my demo goes, or the two demos I have prepared, actually. I hope we have enough time for that. So let's set a little bit of context first. When we think about identity, there are actually also other security concerns that we might want to look at. And here's just the architecture diagram of Camunda 8, the 8.8, the new version of it. You can see on the one hand side, we have our orchestration cluster with components like ZB, operate task list, and then we also have management and design components like console, and then we also have optimize, for example, and the web modeler. And if you think about security, there are multiple points in this architecture where we might have attack surfaces, where we might have challenges if an attacker might want to access our system, right? So there are many different points. I just gave a couple of examples here. There are, of course, different APIs that attackers might want to access, not only from outside the cluster, but you can also think about inside of our orchestration cluster itself. Different nodes are communicating with each other. It's a distributed system, so there might be also attack surfaces in there. We have different databases that we are using. We have different state, so primary storage, for example, which is stored on disk. You can imagine that if you have critical data, personal information inside of your orchestration cluster, that's maybe something where an attacker wants to get access to. So there is definitely some risk, right, if you think about orchestration cluster, and there are some security areas that you might need to consider when you're moving into production with your system. Our teams can help you actually identify what these attack surfaces are in the system and make sure that everything is secure when you're moving into production. There are already also a lot of guides around that. And of course, when you think about our managed service, we have multiple certifications. So for example, we are also SOC 2 certified, our SaaS offering, if you're going for that. So as you can see here on the slide, there are multiple areas. Today, as it was already mentioned, we will look mainly at access control, so identity capabilities, which is the first one here on the list, right? So we are not looking at data protection. We are also not looking into disk encryption. We are not looking into broker security, but mainly into how can we protect the APIs that are being offered and how can we protect the UI, how can we integrate our identity providers of our company that we already have in place. So most of our customers do have identity systems like an Entra ID or an Keycloak, for example, already installed, and they want to utilize that because there a lot of the topics already have been solved for them, so they don't want to reinvent the wheel. That's a little bit the context, right? So we focus on identity access control in the next 20 minutes here. Now, where do we come from and why do we even have this as a topic here today? We have gone through, I would say, pretty rough journey, actually, when we think about identity. So we introduced Camunda 8 roughly 4 years ago, I think, when it became from Camunda Cloud. We transitioned it to being Camunda 8. And we have gone through multiple trials, I would say, how we try to solve the identity question, and we run into a couple of things on the way. If you look at the architecture, how it is today, so before basically next week, so in 8.7 and also previous versions, this is a very typical setup that some of you might already also run in production. I'm not saying that this is completely bad, right, that you can't use it in production, but we will talk a little bit about the challenges that we have with that. That's the architecture. So we have the single identity component, and we can see that more or less all of the components in the stack are reusing or are utilizing this identity component. And we can also see that in the default architecture, this is relying on Keycloak. What is now interesting, if we look into a very practical example, we will directly see some of the complexity. you don't have to understand everything that is here on the slide, right? It's just an example of showing you what complexity is under the hood when we just in the operate user interface, which is a very common interface, if we load that page, what kind of communication is happening in our system under the hood. So we are, when you load operate, we have to access, for example, Keycloak. We have to authenticate the user there. We have to get tenant information. That tenant information is stored not in Keycloak, but it's instead stored in our identity component that we have. Then also we have to retrieve additionally these resource authorizations, which allow you on a very granular level to get access to the system or to specific processes, for example. And a lot of this information is stored in a relational database, where at the same time, the core orchestration cluster, as of today, doesn't even rely on a relational database. So you can see that only by putting identity into the mix of the orchestration cluster, I suddenly have not only the ZB storage that I need to take care of, the operate Elasticsearch storage that I need to take care of, but I also need to take care of a relational database system. So I already have basically like 3 storages just to run the orchestration cluster itself without looking at any other component. On top of that, in the screen that we see here, this is only loading and querying data. We have not on this picture when you, for example, now start modifying process instances or actually make use of the operational features that we have in Operate. So they communicate with the process engine, and the process engine then again would need to load certain data whenever something is being executed, which works very differently to that because it's an 8.7 architecture, it's a different component, everything is implemented in a very different way. If we now would look at task list, it would be again a very similar implementation, but it's basically duplicated code. So also from the maintainability perspective, we have seen that we run into some challenges. However, most of our customers, their feedback was, well, for us, this is not a problem, but the problem is you have Keycloak in the mix. So that was the first problem we surfaced with, I think, 8.3, 8.4. This is where we got most of the feedback. Why? Because for many enterprises today, Keycloak is not something that they can certify for production usage. They already have their own identity providers. So then we thought, okay, let's simply remove Keycloak and introduce the possibility to connect to any IDP. That was basically our first step, right? We introduced that in 8.6, I believe, or 8.5 maybe. And yes, it got us through some points. That's already possible with 8.7, bring your own identity provider. But still, if you look at it, we still had a lot of challenges with access control architecture. So yes, even if you take now away the first point around the installation friction with Keycloak, there is still a lot of other complications. Like, for example, you have to configure your IDP in every single component, right? So operate, task list, ZB. In each of those, you need to configure your IDP in a slightly different way. And then also some functionality is just missing. So ZB APIs didn't even have any protection out of the box, so you could just access them if you didn't write your own interceptor or had any hardening done before. There were also some performance complications and reliability around the identity system. You would have to take care of that separately from the orchestration cluster. So the distributed system of ZB, we didn't really make use of that in the identity component, which was a big problem in itself for many of our customers. So I won't go through all of that, but you can see there are a lot of issues, and that's why we believe that we needed something new, and happy to chat later about all of these details if you want face-to-face. So with 8.8 next week, we're introducing a new identity foundation for our platform. And also to be clear, this is the first step on the journey for actually an enhanced identity and access management system. We have heard today in the keynote as well that there are further enhancements planned, and I'll talk about that later as well. But it's a very big step forward for identity and access control. So on the left-hand side, you can see now that we are introducing a dedicated identity user interface in the orchestration cluster, and we are applying access control across all of the APIs that we have in the orchestration cluster, across operate, task list, ZB, and so on, in the same way. So there's just one way how I think about access control. There's one way how I configure my own identity provider, and there's very granular resource-based permissions. This is for operate task list ZB, and then the management identity, which was formerly this identity component we have seen, will focus with its scope only on these management and modeling components moving forward. So we have a very clear separation of these two domains, and there are very good reasons for that. From our perspective, the orchestration cluster takes care of the hot parts, basically the execution of the processes, of your workflows and production. You have very high resiliency and uptime guarantees that you usually want to promise to your end customers in your organization. And there is where we need to make sure that all of the authorizations and access controls are available immediately to this component. So we need to make sure that it's resilient, but also that latency is very low. We want to have access to all of these authorizations immediately without having to go to other components, whereas in management identity, it's a very different game. It's usually something that I deploy separately. It's for developers or also for business users to develop and design the solutions. But it's not something where I say it has to be 24/7 on, right? Not all the time, because it's mainly internally focused for me inside the organization. So if we look at it from an architecture perspective, that's how it looks, how it changes. The orchestration cluster comes together as one component, includes now an identity UI, access control is included everywhere. Management identity is responsible for the upper part that we see in here. So if we look at an overview around the orchestration cluster, what does it provide? It provides, it's basically an integrated component, right, in the orchestration cluster, and it provides me with authentication and authorization out of the box. It brings everything together, and it handles not only users and groups, but also tenants and access management by that. What is very interesting is that this identity component out of the box comes with different modes how you can run it. So you can say, I don't want any authentication at all because I'm covering that somewhere else in my architecture. We have seen some of our customers do that as well, especially in high throughput scenarios. Or for development purposes, for example. And an alternative is then the basic authentication. So just for getting started quickly, you can even move with that into production if you like to. And the third option, bring your own identity provider that we can have. So these are the different modes that we can run in if we think about self-managed or local development. And of course, in SaaS, the typical way is I use my OIDC access token. And I will show that in a demo in a second as well. For these API usage, we also have a great talk after this where my colleagues will speak more about how to utilize the new orchestration cluster API. So stay tuned for that. That's why I skip a little bit quicker over that part. What is key to understand is how does this authorization system actually work? So how do users and also clients, so client applications that you're implementing, like job workers or connectors, how do they get access to the system? And there are basically two options. So per default, if you're downloading the C8 Run local development environment, then authorizations will be disabled per default, so you don't even have to take care of anything. And in the production installations, authorizations are enabled per default. And then it's a least access privilege system, so it means basically no one has access to anything per default. So if you deploy a process via pipeline, for example, that pipeline also would need to get access to be even able to deploy a process. And per default, no user would see any data or have access to any component. So you actually, as an administrator, need to make sure and think about which user, which group of your identity provider should get access to what resource. And it works on a resource level, which means you define on a per process definition level or on a decision level which group, for example, has access. And we will look into that in a second as well. There's a full, in our documentation, if you click on the next release, you can already see all of the details around which resource types exist and how you configure them, including some examples on typical use cases. Good. So now it's time for demo, and I have like 10 minutes, which is not a lot of time, but we will do it. So we will do local development. I promised that before. We will use Camunda 8 Run. So you can download that as well. Here's maybe the next slide. Just quickly showing you that before we run into that. So camunda.com/download /self-managed. You can download C8 Run very easily. You can also download there our desktop modeler. As a developer, you can get started within a few minutes. That's what I've done before to save us a bit of time, right? So I have C8 Run already running here locally. When you start it up for the first time, it will also show you all the URLs that you need to access the different systems that we have. And now we can jump into my browser. And what is interesting, the first user that you need is demo. So that's username and password. That's only available in C8 Run, so not for the production installation. And here we already see now the first identity screen. You can see I can create users, I can manage groups. I have the possibility to use roles as well that I can assign authorizations to. I have a tenant management inside, and also these are the authorizations we just talked about, right? And what is interesting per default, there are a couple of roles that are automatically created. So for example, I already have an admin role out of the box as well, where this user here is assigned. Let's maybe deploy a process. So we use the Camunda modeler here. I prepared a small test process, not very large, not as cool as the demo we have seen this morning. It has just one user task. Sorry for that. What we will do is we will deploy this process very quickly, and notice here that there's no authentication enabled. So we deploy a process, diagram is deployed, and now we could jump into operate. So let's do that. Localhost, operate. And we can see directly, okay, our first process is deployed. I've tried that before. So you can see our process, right? That's great. So what we can do now as well is via the REST API, we could start a process instance of that process without any authentication. So authentication is disabled, and I can start new process instances locally. So I need to pick the process definition ID, which I find in the modeler, and then I can create my first process instance. And after a second, it will also then show up here in our operate, right? So you can see now the process instance is there. Okay, first success, no authentication. Now let's go a step further, and let's say we all actually are ready now to enable authentication and authorization in our system. That's where you find the security configuration here in your application YAML. And you can see here their initialization configuration for the demo user that we have done already. And it's also assigned to the admin role out of the box, which is quite beneficial because now if we enable authorizations, we will still be able to access the system as an administrator, which is, of course, quite important. And there are two settings I'm changing here now. So one is the authorizations itself. I talked about that. And here my AI Copilot suggests me to change that again. I don't know why. But here the protected API is also important. This is for the REST API to actually say, well, we want that this is protected, right? So I changed these two settings. Need to save that. And then what we do, we once shut down C8 Run, so everything has been killed, and we start it again. This takes a few seconds. It takes a few seconds because Elasticsearch takes a second to start. That's something also we will improve in the future with maybe other database support. But we need to now wait a second here until it's back up. So you can stick around with me, look again once at the configuration. Remember how to do that, right? Because maybe you want to test that out locally in a few minutes after the presentations and in the break. And then you will need to remember where to set that. It's also in the documentation. But if you look at C8 Run, it's the configuration folder and then the application YAML where we need to set it. So it seems like we are done now with the restart. And if we log in with demo, that's our admin user. Oh, typo. Then we can see we still have our process and also can see our process instance. Why is that? Yeah, because it's the admin user, right? I explained that before. Now let's also try to maybe start another instance. If we now send the same request that we have done before, we will get an unauthorized, right? So it's not possible anymore because the API is protected. I haven't passed in any user, so of course that wouldn't work. So that is everything is correct. What we could try now is let's use basic authentication in our REST for our REST request, where we can use perhaps first the demo user. That's the admin. So if I then go to creating a process instance, then we see a process instance can be created because the demo user has the admin role, right? Let's take it a step further, create a new user in our system as well. So we go here to identity. Of course, my session expired. And I create a new user. Let's say Felix at volcano.com. I don't know if that exists. Just coming up with random names. Let's see that we don't have a typo again. Felix. That's important where I need to focus. So now we created a user. This user is now available, and I can use it for requests. Of course, let's try that. What happens next? So I will change here my basic authentication to Felix. And we will try to create a process instance. Well, that's forbidden. Why is it forbidden? Because this user doesn't have any authorizations configured, right? So that's the next thing we need to do. If we hop to our authorizations, there's a resource type for process definitions. And we need to create a new authorization for Felix to be able to create process instances, right? So there are different types of permissions, as you can see, on a quite granular level. And here we can type in now the process, BPMN process ID, but we can also just use star. I will do that, not that I make a copy and paste error here. So then after a second, you will see that if you go to the process definitions, here we have now the right authorization. And if we try for the next time to start a process instance, it will work, right? So that was the end-to-end demo for this piece. That's pretty cool. So it's just one step. There's, of course, a lot more that you can do around tenants, assigning users to tenants. You can also have roles that then have multiple authorizations assigned. And you can also bring your own groups, for example, and your own users, of course, if you're using your own identity provider. Looking at the time, we will skip the SaaS demo, I think, but I want to show you instead a few more things. So just to give you one example, right, we talk now about internal built-in user management, and that is quite handy, especially for development purposes, if you're developing your own system. However, of course, I mentioned earlier, all of you probably have their own identity provider in their organization that you want to configure. There are guides in our documentation already where you can read how to do that. So we have very hands-on guides around Entra ID as an example, and it's quite straightforward. So even I, as a product manager, was able to configure that before. Didn't bring it before because I didn't want to risk that Entra ID somewhere is not available because of the internet. You never know. But this is an example configuration, how it would work for the orchestration cluster. So it's a quite common OIDC configuration, nothing really special that you need to think about. What is important is that you tell basically the orchestration cluster what is the username, so in which claim of the token is the username and where are the groups, right? So that we can read that from the token. And that's pretty much the main thing that you need to remember later on. So what are the benefits of this architecture actually? So on the one hand side, we have this clear separation now, which is really helpful in the first step to have direct access for performance reasons, for example, but also to make it simpler for administrators to understand where do I configure what actually. And we have seen many use cases where in the orchestration cluster, there might be even different set of users and clients than in the rest of the stack. Why is that? Well, because in the orchestration cluster, there's only a very small set of users that typically has access to this operations system in production. We have less complexity in the system and, of course, more security, right, and flexibility because of the systems that I mentioned. I don't have to go into that. What I think is even more interesting is that this foundation that we have built now allows us to build a lot of capabilities on top. So we are not stopping there, but this is really just the first step in our journey, and that's why I want to talk rather 2 more minutes about that and leave maybe 3 minutes for questions. So what are we focusing on next after 8.8? The first step is we need to look at some of the multi-tenancy capabilities to make that simpler and to launch that also in SaaS. So that will come with 8.9. In the next step, there are orchestration cluster auditability capabilities that we have planned. so that you can track in detail which changes have been made to the authorizations. Every single change in the system needs to be audited so that you, from a security perspective, can look at what happened in the system. We have all of this information already available in the system. We just want to expose it to the end users as well via API and UI so that you can search and find out what happened. And then the step that is most important to me personally is the third one here, so the later column. That is where we are looking into this Camunda hub that we have heard about in the keynote today. So there we will basically bring back the identity system all together. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean now that we're going back to this old identity. It rather means that the Camunda hub will be able to manage multiple orchestration cluster identity, give you a single pane view across all of the authorizations that you have, all of the users that are configured, and you can roll out policies from the hub to your orchestration clusters. So you can set up tenants in one view, but still they will be stored individually on the dedicated clusters directly. And that is mainly for performance and resiliency reasons. So you get this good user experience via the hub, but at the same time we make sure that we actually follow these the best practice around keeping the authorizations very close to the hot paths of the execution engine. And I think with that, that's all I have today, and would go to questions.
Very detailed introduction to our new identity. We do have several questions in Slido here, so we'll just run through them real quick. First one, any updates to client resource authorization? This is regarding the machine-to-machine communication, for example, using API clients who use the task list APIs.
Yep, the perfect question. So that was actually in the second demo, which we didn't see today because of time reasons. I'm happy to show it after. So these authorizations that we have introduced, they also work on the API level. So that means also when I'm using connectors, job workers, and so on, they're also applied in the same way. When I configure the access, for basic authentication, I would use the user as I've seen in the REST API. But if we are using OIDC, I would use the client ID for my worker or my connector that I'm using for authentication. And I can configure that the same granular access that we have seen for the UI a second ago.
Great. Next question. One of our struggles today with Entra SSO is the inability to add users without first having them go through the invite process. So will we now be able to onboard users from existing IDP assets independent of user action?
Mm-hmm. My assumption is that this is mainly speaking about SaaS, if not, maybe I'm overseeing something. In SaaS, for now, it stays in a very similar way as today. So you need to onboard users manually, basically, to the console. But there are also some plans to change that in the future.
Okay. And can you talk about the upgrade path to this new identity architecture?
Yeah. So the update path is actually, from the engineering perspective, I think one of the hardest parts that the team had to solve over the last couple of months. So from 8.7 to 8.8, there are some architectural changes coming. And from my perspective, I've run through this migration myself as well. It's quite smooth. So especially if you're using the Helm chart itself, it's basically just in Helm updated, and most of the things run on their own. So there's some identity data migration happening in the background to make sure that the users have access to the same things before and after the migration. But yes, deployment artifacts are changing. So there are some topics that you need to look into during the migration.
Perfect. And we're just about at time, but one last quick question. What are the most common IDPs you're hearing customers are using?
Yeah. So my experience, maybe you have even more experience around it, but from my side, it's mainly Entra ID what we are seeing, so 70–80% Entra ID. We have seen some Okta installations as well. There are some Keycloak installations, but not that widespread. Mm-hmm. And then there are also some customers have even some custom implementations on top of other IDPs.
Yeah, we definitely see the custom implementations, but otherwise consistent with my experience as well. So Felix, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, everyone.